Kia ora koutou, kia ora koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Talofa lava, malolele, pule vanaka, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. Ko tombaki tuku inua. I'm just welcoming you tonight to this Fabian's event. We have, and it's my pleasure to introduce Craig Renney, who's going to speak to us tonight around his various thoughts on the on tonight's lecture. Craig Renney is a economist and a director of policy for the New Zealand Trade Union for the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. And prior to this role, Craig spent 5 years working for Grant Robertson as the New Zealand Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, as well as a senior advisor, and worked with Jacinda Ardern as the Prime Minister. Craig helped deliver 3 welfare budgets, costed successfully in 2017 to 2020, and election manifestos for Labour. He worked on the COVID-19 economic response. Craig's a regular commentator in news, print and in the media, and talks extensively on labour relations, industrial relations, including fair pay agreements, income insurance, and tripartite future of work forum. Craig's worked for New Zealand Treasury, MBIE, the New Zealand Reserve Bank, and also extensively in his role in the UK. And Craig was elected to the New Zealand Labour Policy Council, along with Joe Spratt, Michael Wood, Georgia Danzy, and Toby Moore. Craig has always been a great friend of the trade union movement. I've always appreciated Craig's endless enthusiasm to come and talk to people, including at a very short notice asking him to come to Hamilton to speak to 5 union officials about economics in the middle of winter. And he said yes at very short notice and travelled. And not everyone says yes to that, so I really appreciate all you do for the Labour movement. You're a huge treasure, and I'm deeply looking forward to having you share your insights tonight. I will just ask the audience as we go through Craig's speech, if you do hold your questions to the end, and we'll get an opportunity to run the microphone to you, and we'll make sure that you get a chance to ask. So the reason we're doing that is because we are recording tonight, and it will be a good opportunity for people to hear your questions. Thanks very much. Craig.
Thank you, Tom. Me and Tom didn't discuss that before we went on stage, and so I was just guessing when these things were going to appear on screen. And the only one that Tom missed is that I'm a member of the Fabian Society. And you should be too. So I've been told that I can't move from the spot by my director, which is not my natural place to be, so I'm probably going to fidget during the rest of tonight, because me standing still for an hour does not happen at the best of times, I mean at the worst of times. So forgive me if I move around an awful lot. A little bit of background about myself. I came to New Zealand in 2012 to work for the Treasury. I never imagined myself moving to New Zealand. When I came here, I'd never been to New Zealand before. Never been south of the equator before. And I came to the Treasury to work in the health department. And they said, can you look after health for us in the Treasury? And I said, sure, why not? I know nothing about the New Zealand health system. So whilst I was waiting for my visa, I spent 3 months researching the New Zealand health system. And then on my first day, my manager said, there's been a slight change in plan. Would you look after housing? And I said... And I came to the Treasury to work. Even worse. And I said, of course, what could possibly be wrong with New Zealand housing? Nobody lives here. There's loads of trees. There's loads of empty space. This'll be easy, right? And I was put in charge of the social housing reform programme, which was Bill English's then attempt to then sell all of the social housing in the country. So I've got very mixed memories recently hearing Bill English tell us that there are problems in social housing, because I may have heard all of those problems before, and all of those things are coming back to haunt us, which is one of the things, one of the recurring messages of tonight, if you take nothing else away, is that many of the economic myths that we'll be talking about tonight have been used before, and will be used again. And we're going to hear them over and over again, unfortunately, over the next few weeks. Without any further ado, I want to talk to you about why the minimum wage is bad for the economy and why that myth exists. Government spending is causing inflation and why that myth exists. That unemployment is a price worth paying to solve that inflation and why that myth exists. that New Zealand has a great tax system, and why that myth exists, and why the National Party is better at economics, and why that myth exists. Now, if you can withhold your barracking right up until the very end, that would be lovely. All of these things, again, speak to this common story of we hear these things over and over again in the press and in the media, and we hear over and over again that these myths are real. So, starting at the top, the first claim, that the minimum wage causes unemployment. It causes higher wages, which drive employers to reduce employment. It causes inflation. Higher wages drive higher prices, leading to, oh crikey, perhaps the screen's rotating. Is it higher inflation? Do we have a technical problem with the screen?
Oh, sorry, it's just not coming on here. So,
it's
on there.
No.
Turn it on and off again. There it is. And that the minimum wage causes inflexibility, that minimum wage isn't sufficiently flexible and drives poor labour market outcomes. Now, we've all heard this story before. And we've heard the story. I can tell you minimum wage was created in the UK in 1997, when we set the wage at £3.97 an hour. And it was set at that wage very deliberately, so it was less than £4. And when it was set at that rate, and it was supposed to be the end of Western civilization in the UK. Would the last employer to leave the UK please turn the lights out? Now, it's so popular now, we no longer have a minimum wage in the UK, we now have a national living wage. Because Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, decided that the minimum wage was such a good vote winner that he was going to make it the living wage in the UK. Unfortunately, he didn't set it at the living wage rate. He created a new living wage and then called it that. So not everything's great, but minimum wage causes all these problems, right? And why is this important right now? Because the minimum wage in 2023, full-time, is $47,210. There's a missing zero on the end there. To keep up with inflation, workers need to earn $49,435 this year, as of April the 1st. That's the cost of inflation. Instead, they will now earn $48,152 because the minimum wage went up by 2%, not 4 and a bit percent, according to inflation. So that leaves a gap of $1,283 a week, or just shy of $25 a week. Now, according to the National Party's tax calculator, a single minimum wage worker on full-time work will get $12.54 as a tax cut. Great. But they're still $12.15 behind. That means that they're $632 a year worse off as a consequence of the minimum wage changes. And that's before the things that the public sector cuts are paying for. So that before low-cost prescriptions, which is up to $100 a year, half-price public transport fees, free school meals, all those things which could get lost, and those costs are on top of that loss which is already there. And so what is the reality about the minimum wage? What does the evidence tell us about where the minimum wage is and what difference it actually makes to workers? Well, David Card, a US economist, won the 2021 Nobel Prize for Economics for demonstrating that, among other things, increasing the minimum wage does not necessarily lead to fewer jobs as was previously thought. In fact, he looked at minimum wage changes in New York and New Jersey, because there's a natural difference between the two. In New York, voted to have a minimum wage increase, New Jersey didn't, and what he thought was at the border, fast food restaurants would jump sides, and workers would jump sides, and so there'll be people employed in New Jersey, even though it's just across the road, because of the minimum wage difference. Instead, employment in New York went up. Demand for goods and services, demand for fast food restaurants in New York went up. Why did it go up? Because workers had money in their pockets. Exactly the kinds of fast food restaurants which are visited by exactly the kinds of people who were on the minimum wage, who suddenly had a decent income, could now afford the very burgers they were often flipping in the first place. And that's a picture of David collecting his Nobel Prize for that. Now, it's not rocket science. In New Zealand, NZIER economists have examined the minimum wage and found exactly that, what they call a Goldilocks zone of up to $25 an hour would have exactly zero impact on employment in New Zealand. And that research was 2 years ago. So that will actually be higher now, and it's no surprise that the living wage is higher than that now, because it's in exactly that Goldilocks zone. It allows people to lead lives of decency and meaning, but actually means we don't impact overall employment. And it's not just NZIER, it's MOTU, which said we find no clear evidence that increases in the minimum wage have led to adverse employment effects. Instead, the minimum wage is not a dominant factor in employment. The minimum wage doesn't affect employment in New Zealand. That's the evidence in New Zealand. It doesn't affect employment around the world. That's the evidence around the world. If the minimum wage was $50 an hour, I'd be the first person outside campaigning against it, because it really would affect employment. But it doesn't. And instead, we can increase the minimum wage to the living wage, and it will have zero impact on employment in New Zealand. Even MBIE doesn't agree. In its last review of the minimum wage, it said the minimum wage increases have not been cited by economic forecasters as significant factors driving consumer price inflation. The minimum wage does not cause inflation, does not cause the current cost of living challenges. However, whilst there's been some commentary on pressure, the consensus view is that increased wage costs, including minimum wage increases, are not currently the primary driver of CPI inflation. Other things are. Wages are not driving inflation. Wages are not driving unemployment, particularly not for those on the minimum wage. We can increase it, and we can have confidence in increasing it without worrying about the consequences on workforces. So let's look at the next claim, that the government spending has created the current cost of living crisis. And everyone's heard this down from that cutting spending will solve our problems, that it's all that wasteful spending that's driving all of the CPI, that everything's been if we just deliver some tax cuts, that will help. Now, these are nice statements, but do they have any validity? So I want to look at spending as a percentage of GDP. Because if spending had gone up and inflation had gone up, then we'd be able to see that in the data, right? So this is spending as a percentage of GDP going back to 1994. That dotted line is if you take away COVID expenditure. Spending as a percentage of GDP, according to the government's own books, is essentially flat. Since 1994. It's actually come down a little bit. Why is spending now driving inflation? It's not. There's no relationship between these two. In fact, spending was higher during this period here because of Christchurch. We were spending money repairing Christchurch at the time. We're spending money here because that's COVID. That's what governments do. It's not driving inflation. Inflation wasn't suddenly higher during this period and then higher during this period. What drove inflation was international factors. It was oil prices. It was shipping. It was a range of other goods and services. It's not government spending. Government spending would have to be massively changed. And if you don't believe me, if you think, well, come on, Craig, what's this? I'll do this chart again, but I'll put the political colours on it. It's just the same. Actually, spending doesn't cause GDP, doesn't cause CPI inflation in the same way. There's no correlatory evidence to that effect. And this is percentages of GDP. It's basically inside 2 or 3% of GDP. It's making no difference at all. So what's the reality? So there's a really good study for those of you who desperately want to find it called Is Inflation Fiscally Determined? Which starts in 2020 and works back over 60 years in 45 different countries and looks at whether or not inflation can be fiscally determined. Do increases in government spending therefore then drive CPI inflation across 45 nations examined? The evidence is nope. All the time series data is it does not drive discretionary spending, non-discretionary spending, none of it actually drives CPI inflation. And that's not just that study, That's also the findings of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, which also examined the study particularly for the US and for the UK and found no relationship between the two. Even the IMF says that you can cut spending if you want to, but if you want to protect people, you've actually got to safeguard the poor who benefit the most from public services. And that cuts in lower priority spending must be combined with larger transfers to make up the difference for low income groups. The strategy results by design in no drop in consumption for the poor, which is exactly the opposite of what we have right now. Government spending over time in New Zealand does not drive CPI. The evidence from overseas shows that it does not drive CPI inflation. And the evidence from New Zealand, so this is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. There's a wonderful, I love economists because we have to justify our suits, right? So quantifying fiscal multipliers in New Zealand, the evidence from SVAR models. What does that mean? I don't know. But what it does mean, is the impulse in aggregate demand from an increase in transfers and public investment appears to be short-lived. Right? So you spend some money, right? It has an impact on overall levels of government demand and therefore overall levels of CPI, but it's short-lived, with the peak occurring within the first 2 quarters, i.e. after 6 months it's worked its way through the system. On the other hand, the positive impact on GDP from an increase in public consumption or a decrease in tax revenue is more long-lasting. And that's important because that increase in tax revenue, the decrease in tax revenue is about to happen. So we have the possibility that actually we're going to use the wrong tool to tackle inflation. That's in front of us. And you say, well, Craig, didn't the previous government increase consumption? Didn't the previous government spend lots more money? This is Budget 23 from the Treasury. And in Budget 23, they said, real government consumption, a measure of government services provided by the government, is expected to decline over the forecast period, partly reflecting the winding down of COVID-19 spending. This is a sizable reduction in real government consumption within a short time span. That was the previous government. That's the Treasury. That's not the government, that's the Treasury. We're cutting it we're trying to get it 3 times more quickly than the previous government was going to cut. But we're using that to deliver a tax cut. What do we learn about a tax cut? Is that the impact on GDP is longer lasting. We're likely to actually drive up inflation in future as a consequence of the spending mix. Previously, the government was reducing government spending, but it wasn't delivering the tax cut on the other side. That was going to cut CPI inflation. This is likely to increase it. So let's look at this wasteful spending that's going to be reduced. It's going to be cut. And I put this in just to test all of your eyesight. But if I look at the areas that are likely to be cut, right, we've got DPMC, supporting activities that address cybersecurity threats and improving cybersecurity resilience. That's in the chopping line. That's in the chopping block. If we look at a whole-of-government approach to prevent, address and eliminate family violence and sexual violence as related services and support to ministers. We're going to cut family and sexual violence funding. And we're going to cut the money to the Serious Fraud Office. Right. Hands up, how much last year did welfare fraud cost the government? Any guess? Random guess.
20 million.
Keep going, bit north. 47. How much did we spend finding welfare fraud? 47 million. How much did white-collar crime, including tax evasion, cost New Zealand last year? $7 billion. How much did we fund the Serious Fraud Office, which we're going to cut their budget? $17 million. Our priorities are in the wrong place. We're going to cut funding for biosecurity monitoring. We're going to cut funding for search and rescue activities. We're going to cut funding for services that support the work in the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, and the High Court system. Because this is wasteful spending, right? This is the spending that's going to help reduce the cost of living for everyone. All right? We're going to cut, just in case anyone really thought, processing administration aspects of payments of veterans' pensions and related allowances. Laser-like focus on the cost of living and getting New Zealand back on track. And so tax cuts will help, right? So who will tax cuts help? Will they help those on welfare? No, because welfare rates are paid net of tax. You get a tax cut, it makes no difference to a welfare payment. Will they help those on the minimum wage? No, we've already seen that those on the minimum wage will still be worse off after the tax cut. Will they help tackle child poverty? Tax cuts will actively make it harder to achieve our 9 child poverty targets because they give more to those who have higher incomes. That drives higher incomes after tax up. That actually shifts the cost for the government of tackling child poverty over the next few years. Will tax cuts help control prices such as rates or insurance? Nope. And actually those are the 2 things that are currently driving CPI inflation. Will tax cuts help improve our productivity? Well, we're giving $3 billion to landlords. We have 91% of all of our assets are locked up in housing, which is why we have one of the lowest productivity records anywhere in the Western world, because we put all of our investments into housing rather than into plant, materials, other things that would actually drive a more productive economy. Because you can make tax-free gains from housing, but every time you earn $1 from earnings, you have to pay tax on it. The answer to all these questions is no. So who are tax cuts benefiting? They're not delivering the cost of living change that we hoped. And even National's a bit worried about this. So this was National's back pocket boost payment. It's website where you could download its policy document. Trust me, I think I'm a regular super user of that button. But down here, there was a little thing you could say, try our tax calculator to find out how much you will keep. Yeah? This site can't be reached. They got rid of it today. Just before the budget, they went, do you know what we don't need is a reminder of how much you were going to get. So they've taken that down as of today. So it does appear as if they're all a little bit worried it's not going to be the laser-like focus on the cost of living that they thought it would be during the election campaign. So, the claim that unemployment is a price worth paying to tackle inflation. Because stopping inflation will hurt less than unemployment, right? And that there's no other way of it working. We've got to trade these 2 things off. Economic theory tells us that unemployment and inflation are 2 sides of the same coin, and if one goes up, the other one goes down. That's the Phillips curve, right? Bill Phillips, the great New Zealand economist, designer of the Moniac system, who said these 2 things relate to each other. And that losing a few public sector jobs doesn't make that much difference. So, what's the evidence for that? Because again, it's just an unsupported claim. It's just a claim made sort of, like, oh, that must be true. Well, we're really lucky in New Zealand because we have a guy called Professor McCulloch, Robert McCulloch at Auckland University, who is probably one of the world's leading authors on the impacts of unemployment and inflation. And the impacts on the well-being impacts. He's been talked about in the New York Times. He's written numerous articles around the world on this. And the answer is pretty straightforward. Higher unemployment is worse than higher inflation if you go by the feelings of real people. If you ask people what's their well-being impact, and this is supported by work from Professor Danny Blanchflower at the London School of Economics, a 1% increase in unemployment has 5 times the well-being impact of a 1% increase in inflation. And in New Zealand, that finding is 10 times. And that's airy-fairy well-being analysis, right? Sort of how do you feel when you lose your job as opposed to anything else. Well, let's look at wage scarring. Wage scarring is when you lose your job and You get a new job, and the next job doesn't pay as much as the last job because you were desperate to find a job. You didn't get any kind of welfare support, so you took the first job that was available. It didn't meet your skills, didn't match what you wanted, but you took it because you needed to keep a roof over your head and keep putting food on the table, right? MBIE estimates that the lifetime wage scarring from the displacement of workers in 1 year, so the cost for the rest of their lives of just the wage losses in 1 year, is $9.76 billion. That's the difference for the wages that those workers make for the rest of their lives. That's 67,000 workers losing their jobs in the average each year. In a recession year, that rises to $15 billion. That's real world consequences of unemployment. And we have that in New Zealand because we have a terrible welfare state which doesn't replace your income. And doesn't replace your income if your partner's in work or you've got assets above the threshold. If we were in a country which has much better outcomes, Sweden, Denmark, you would have a replacement rate for your income that was much higher. You would have support back into work. You'd have an active labour market programme to the point that in Sweden, if you lose your job, you access a job security council. It says, what was your job? Do you have any skills needs? And if you're in a job where the skills are no longer going to be valuable in 5 years' time, they will retrain you for free. They will pay you 80% of your salary for 6 months, your previous salary for 6 months, whilst you find those skills. People who lose their job in Sweden have better labour market outcomes than people who stay in their jobs. That's the difference a state can make. Instead, we in New Zealand choose to make people unemployed to keep the cost of a tin of beans marginally lower. It's a price worth paying. And this isn't just a theoretical risk. This is the increasing number of people who are going to be unemployed according to the Reserve Bank's forecasts, the monetary policy statement in May. And what we see is that essentially we're going to increase the number of people since the current government took office by 42,100. We're going to increase unemployment by 35% over the next 2 years, to the end of 2025. And this is their current guess. My guess, for what it's worth, is that number will be worse. Because GDP won't come in as quick, because inflation's going to be higher for longer, because we've just given everyone a tax cut. So that means interest rates will be higher for longer, which means unemployment will be higher for longer. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is US unemployment. So this is the FRED, which is the US statistical system that manages you can get all the data from. And you can see COVID here. But then, this is January 2022. Unemployment is 3.4%. By the end of the period, it's 3.9%. It's gone up, but not a huge amount. And by US standards, that's incredibly historically low. This is inflation over the same time period. Inflation has fallen rapidly back towards the target, to the Federal Reserve's target, but unemployment has remained low. Why is that the case? Because the US government had the Inflation Reduction Act. It invested in its economy. It actually delivered skills. It delivered economic change. It planned for that change. New Zealand's doing the opposite. It's delivering an unjust transition rather than the just transition the US system has gone for. And it's made that decision very deliberately. So the public sector workforce is out of control though, right? We've all heard this. Right? Too many bureaucrats sipping oat milk lattes, sort of, dancing around the terrace, just gadflies from meeting to meeting. I know, I used to be one. It was soy milk latte for me, actually. But anyway, right? What has been the increase as a proportion of the workforce in the public service? Or since Labour came to office? Any guesses? 5%. 0. None. At all. This data goes back to 1990. It was 20% Under Chris Hipkins, it was 20% under Jacinda Ardern. It was 20% under Bill English. It was 20% under John Key. It was 20% under Helen Clark. It was 20% under Jenny Shipley. In fact, it was higher before then. The public sector workforce is gone up with the overall population. That's it. This isn't my data. This is the quarterly employment survey of Statistics New Zealand. It's freely available. You can go online and find it. I'll show you where if you want. Right? The data tells us that there has been no rapid expansion in the public sector workforce. Instead, there's just simply been a growth with the overall size of the overall workforce, which is what you'd expect, right? And that workforce includes doctors, nurses, everybody else. That's not just the core bureaucrats wandering around the place. So, why is the public workforce out of control? Well, it's not. Which leads us to our last line, that there's no other way of stopping it. So, the public sector hasn't gone out. Public sector spending is not out of any kind of historical norm. The public sector workforce isn't out of any kind of historical norm. Unemployment was low, but it's likely to rise quite rapidly over the next few years. Is there another way that we could tackle inflation, or is there another indicator that's heading in a particular direction that we could look at and say, actually, if we did something about that, that could help reduce inflation and the cost of living? This is profit. So this is corporate tax. Corporate tax is paid as a percentage of overall profits of firms. Between 2019 and the end of the forecast period, according to the pre-election economic and fiscal update, it will have increased by 93% over 7 years. But people have to become unemployed to reduce the cost of living, right? People have to lose their jobs. We have to cut down that wasteful bureaucracy which is the public service. But no one anywhere has ever said that profit line has to change. No one anywhere has said that we should be looking to control corporate profits to help reduce the cost of living. Instead, we say we've got to cut employment. If I go to the next claim, that New Zealand has a world-leading tax system, because we're all told again that New Zealand has a broad-based, low-rate tax system. That's IRD's mantra. That we tax a lot of things, but we're going to tax them a little amount, and therefore it doesn't affect any of our economic decisions. It doesn't distort the system, according to the Treasury, in accordance to IRD. New Zealand's taxation system is progressive. You pay more money if you earn more, right? If you make more money, you pay more tax. And why is this important now? Because we've got big public sector cuts to pay for $3 billion of money going to landlords. We're taking $2 billion from climate change so that we can give it to higher income earners as a tax cut. But that's okay, right? Because the tax system is good. We just need to reform it a little bit, and this will help cut the cost of living, and it will help make things better. Only, this is the 2023 International Tax Competitiveness Index. When we look at the data, we can see the top country, the most competitive tax system in the world, is Estonia. Followed by Latvia. Followed by New Zealand. They're the third most competitive tax system anywhere in the world. That's not me. It's the International Tax Competitiveness Index, or the International Tax Institute. Just New Zealand is just ahead of Switzerland in terms of its tax competitiveness. Think about that. We're ahead of Switzerland. We're ahead of Luxembourg, which is a tax haven. We're ahead of Liechtenstein, which is a tax haven. We're ahead of a range of other countries, but we need to have a more competitive tax system to compete, right? That's our key problem. Instead, where's Australia? It's here. But Australia's putting its taxes up. But it's got a bigger economy, it's got better incomes, it's got lower inflation, it's got lower interest rates. Why is tax the solution to our problem when we have the third most competitive tax system anywhere in the world? And if we look at the sources of taxation, this yellow line, which is other, is essentially social taxation and capital taxation. What you can see from New Zealand, which is at the far end here, we tax all of our income on individuals. 50% of our taxation comes from PAYE, from taxation on individuals and residential withholding tax. If we're doing this anywhere else than the rest of the developed world, this yellow bar would take up around 30-40%. In New Zealand it doesn't, because we don't have a broad-based low-rate tax system. We have a very narrow tax system, which is not very low rate for a lot of people. And we have a zero tax system in a range of areas that other countries would have taxes in, be they social security taxes or a capital gains tax. And that means we don't tax us properly. What does that look like in the real world? The richest New Zealanders essentially pay half the tax rate of the rest of us. According to an IRD study just before the last election, from the 311 wealthiest families, they pay a marginal tax rate of 9%. You lot pay a marginal tax rate of 22%. Yeah? And if you want to know what that looks like in the real world, this is the average household wealth of those 311 families, and that's you. And I say that's you because that's the average New Zealander, 400,000. This is $277 million, which is the wealth of the 311 wealthiest families in New Zealand, and yet they're paying less than half the tax rate of you. But remember, we've got a broad-based, low-rate tax system, which is progressive, right? That's the claim. So what about this other claim, that the National Party is the party of business and understands the economy? The economy grows under national governments, right? It doesn't grow under Labour governments, it grows under national governments. National governments save and Labour governments spend. This is the cycle of things. I've heard so many journalists tell me, it's just a cycle. You lot turn up and you spend all the cash, and then the other lot turns up and it repairs the books, and it just goes on and on and on, right? And that's how these things work. And why is this important right now? Because we've got this fundamental shift in emphasis in government. We're moving towards more market-driven solutions. Everything from charter schools in education, that we're going to see the role of the state fundamentally diminished. And the role of the state, so Gabriel Aaron, one of my favourite books, New Public Management, 1974, it's a hit, read it, it'll be great. Right? Gabriel Aaron Osborne, right? One of the famous lines in it is that the role of the state is to steer and not row. And that is how this government views its role. It's to steer and not do. So everything from charter schools to the delivery of community housing and state housing will now be delivered via market mechanisms. And we're going to remove the high employment, high wages goal that was there under the previous government. Unemployment will be less than 4%, and wages would rise faster than inflation in each year. And we're going to return to existing growth pools in New Zealand, which is a fancy term as economists use, which essentially means that we will sell housing to each other again. You know, Bernard Hickey famously said that this is a housing market with an economy tacked on the edge. Right? And that's true. Right? We're going to return to immigration as a driver of growth. It's really easy to grow the economy by 2% when the population is growing by 2%. Right? Last year we took in 113,000 net new Zealanders. Right? For the benefit of the tip, that's great. I'd far rather live in a country where people were trying to get into it than people were trying to leave. Yeah? But that's a little bit less than the population of Dunedin. Yeah? Dunedin has 2 hospitals, 74 state schools. It has 1,443 state houses. It has a law court, a family court, and a high court. It has 3 WINS offices. It has 7 police stations. It has 13 fire stations. We need all of these things. It has 74 GP practices with 124 GPs. We need to build that every year. And we're not. And we're going to export more low-value products, because that's what we do. Yeah? Now, New Zealand in 2021 was the world's largest exporter of raw logs. Yeah? But between 1994 and 2023, imports of furniture went up 700%. So we export raw logs and we import desks. We can't build houses in New Zealand because we don't have any timber, because we've exported the timber overseas. We're closing mills in New Zealand because the mills can't get access to logs that are literally in the field next door. And so, over the past 35 years, I've looked at what's happened on various markers of the economy to help understand whether or not National or anybody else is better off at delivering on the economy. And so, Labour has grown the economy on average, so this is expenditure measure of GDP over the past 35 years. 35 years is chosen because that's literally as far back as the data goes and a readily available format for Stats NZ. So 3.1% for Labour over the past 35 years on average. That's national. 2.6. The economy doesn't grow any faster under national on average than it does under Labour. In fact, if we look at the unemployment rate, which is my preferred measure of progress, GDP is an entirely meaningless measure. And it tells us when we break windows and we replace them. This is the real measure, unemployment. That's the unemployment rate on average over the past 35 years under Labour. Just a little under 5%. That's the average under national. Just a little under 7%. Again, people are not better off on average under national governments. Not my data, it's not me making this up, that's just a statistical reality. So the economy doesn't grow faster, there's more people unemployed, and so Labour Party spends all the money, right? And that's, taxes you, spends all the money, that's what's true. This is core current tax receipts as a percentage of GDP. Just a little under 30%. That's national. Past 35 years, it's an identical number. You don't get taxed more. There is no statistical reality to that lazy assumption that the economy grows faster, or that we do more, or that unemployment's better, or that anything's better. It's just that. It's a lazy assumption that isn't supported by the data. But that was history. The key thing is, what about now? What do we do now? We've had a 100-day plan, and it's chock full of successes for New Zealand. Since taking office, the coalition government has delivered the following. It's ended fair pay agreements. Because, we really were gilding the lily, right, on workers' rights in New Zealand. Right? I mean, blimey, right? Sort of ending fair pay agreements. We've seen the return of 90-day trials. 90-day trials which the Treasury's own evidence tells us make no difference to employment. And specifically make no difference to the employment of the unemployed. We've seen the loss of the employment mandate from the Reserve Bank. So we now no longer care what unemployment does when the Reserve Bank makes a decision on the interest rate. We've seen cuts to investment in public services, $3 billion tax cuts to landlords, and we've ended the Māori Health Authority because Māori Health was going so well. Right? And we've ended the Māori Health Authority at the same time as we've brought back tobacco products. Because it brings back $1.5 billion of new funding into the Exchequer over the next 4 years, at the cost of 5,000 lives a year. I actually don't think these two things are unrelated. So what should worry you? At least the 100-day plan was advertised, right? Right? The coalition agreements, which, only saddos like me have read, right, all show the following. We're going to have a first principles review of health and safety law. Right? First principles health. New Zealand kills roughly 17 workers a week. As a consequence of their work, we kill 17 workers a week. We put someone in hospital as a consequence of their work, and it takes them out of work for 5 days or longer every 15 minutes. In the time I'll have finished talking here, 4 workers will have been hurt long enough to spend a week out of work. But apparently what we need is a first principles review of health and safety law, because the Minister for Workplace Relations is worried that employers have to put up too many posters. We're going to put time restrictions on benefits. The New Zealand First National Agreement discusses the modelling and setting up of time restrictions for under 25s, so that under 25s will only be able to access an employment benefit and a range of benefits for 2 years cumulatively for benefits. So once you've had your 2-year allowance, best of luck. We're going to restrict access to housing support. We're going to end the right to be an employee. So the Act National Agreement says that the current, what's called the Section 6 of the Employment Relations Act, which allows someone to take their employer to court to prove that they're an employee rather than a contractor. If they've ever signed an agreement to be a contractor, they will be deemed to be a contractor forever, regardless of the true nature of their employment. That means no more Uber cases. That means no more being able to take your employer to court and say, I'm an employee, I'm entitled to sick leave, I'm entitled to maternity or paternity leave, I'm entitled to ACC, and everything else. Nope. If you've ever signed a contract agreement, you will be a contractor forever. We're going to bring back automatic firearms, because that's what New Zealand needs right now, is automatic firearms. It's the things we can't see beyond this that should worry us. Because all of this will get delivered in the first 18 months. But there's still 18 months of government after that to then worry about. And that should truly terrify us. And why should it worry you? Because frankly, the government's books are a mess. The tax cut package over the next 4 years, according to the government's own books, is $14.6 billion. Only the money isn't there. Right now, it's about $5.5 billion short. And the economy is not firing on all cylinders. Consumer spending is falling, investment is down. Austerity adds to these problems. It doesn't make them better. There's no evidence anywhere around the world that actually installing an austerity program helps to grow the economy. I come from a country where we have destruction tested this. It's the reason I'm here. And this will likely mean higher unemployment and then deeper cuts to public services, because the economy doesn't grow, the tax revenues don't come in to pay for the tax cuts that have been promised, and we go round this merry-go-round over and over and over again. And so, right now in New Zealand, we have an investment gap. And so, the CTU's did a bit of modelling on what the investment gap is and what the impact of that is. And so, we've examined the gap in public investment in New Zealand over the next 4 years, because migration is going to be higher than forecast even just a couple of years ago. This creates a gap of up to $22.1 billion. That's services, buildings, everything else that should exist and won't. Because if we spent the average amount on the next person coming into the country, that's the gap in spending is dictated on the current government's plans. And that's more money than we spend on secondary education over that period. And that gap will get larger and larger, because over the next few years, migration was likely to be higher than expected again and again and again. And that gap is on top of the $210 billion existing infrastructure gap that already exists in New Zealand. So we're going to play a game called Find Me an Excuse. We're going to find increased use of diversions. We're going to blame welfare beneficiaries for these problems. We're going to blame other things. We're going to say, it's all these people, sapping the state. We're going to see a handover of power in 18 months' time, and I can't wait. I've worked with Winston Peters. I haven't worked with Mr. Seymour, but I've worked with Mr. Peters. I can't see this going well. But it will be a giant diversion to the ability of government to deliver the goods and services and the things you all need. We're going to cut public investment. And the best example of that is the IREX program, the Cook Strait ferries. It's going to cost us roughly $300 million in terms of the cost, the cut contract, just to stop the ferries from turning up. Then we've got a write-off of about another $300 million in terms of the write-off of the costs on either side of the infrastructure. And then we have to find 3 replacement ferries that don't exist, none of whom can take rail, which means we end the ability to use rail to go across the Crook Strait. And here's my favourite bit. The ferries then have to abide by new International Marine Organization rules on low sulphur, because they use bunker oil to go backwards and forwards. It emits a lot of sulphur. Yeah? In the short run, until they're fixed, the only way that works is if they go slower. So we're going to have to go slower at more cost to not pay for some ferries that we should have bought in the first place. We're going to cause fear. Mr. Luxon's already talked about this being a fragile economy. That, we're in a dangerous place. And we're going to see the increased use of limited envelope tactics. Right? There's only so much money. There's only so much investment. There's only so much we can do. None of these things are true. They're all choices. And we're going to set up false targets for delivery. My personal favourite, we've got 9 new targets for better public service targets in the country. My personal favourite is the violent crime. We're going to reduce violent crime by 20,000 over the next few years. Yeah? Great. Violent crime went up 20,000 last year. There were 185,000 victimisations as opposed to 165,000 victimisations the year before. Only that's not true, because that's a survey. And we have fewer people responding to the survey every year, so we don't really know how many victimisations there are. And that survey is called the 23 survey, right? Only the data is for 2021, 2022. So next year, when we get the results in, when the results will likely be lower, it will be under the previous government's watch, because it'll be the data for 2022, 2023. And we'll have to wait 3 years for the results of the first year's government's data coming in, at which point we'll have no idea whether or not any of their policies or programs have actually delivered the reductions in violent crime. We're going to promise good times ahead. I stand here as a tall, handsome, white male economist, right? And I promise you there's going to be a tax cut program on offer in 25, 26. You can all say the lines right now. We've all done it tough. You've done the mahi. Now it's time for the treats. Vote for us again, and we'll deliver you another tax cut. Because that's what's going to solve our problems, right? So I say to you this as a British person. I left the UK to move to New Zealand in 2012. Since 2012, we've had Brexit, child poverty has exploded, we've lost the right to strike, we've had a decade of lost growth and wages, and we've been sending refugees to Rwanda, a country we take refugees from. And we do all of that because in 2010, when we changed the government, I was told, don't worry about it, Craig, go to New Zealand, come back in 6 months, right? There's 2 posh boys in charge, they're really unpopular, things will go back to normal. All of these things have occurred since. And we've had 14 years of that government. So I'm here to ask you a favour. How do we talk about economic myths? How do we explode economic myths? How do we show a different future as possible? The answer is, we have to start right now. The next election is 920 days away. And we can't waste a day explaining to people that what they're being told isn't true, isn't the only truth, that what they're being told isn't natural. Everything here is a choice, and we can make different choices and do different things if we want to. We have to articulate a different vision for New Zealand, and we have to recruit and organise to that different vision. I'm a member of the Labour Party Policy Council, but I don't care if you work for the Green Party, Tea Party Māori. I don't care if you work for TOP. No, I actually do care if you work for TOP. But I don't care who you work for. We have to explain that there is a different and better view of the economy, and one that is actually more popular and better, and will deliver better outcomes for New Zealanders. So the question has to be asked, what has to be done and what can you do to help do that? And I want to give you the example of the National Party and crime. 18 months before the last election, the National Party started banging on about crime, about ram raids, about youth offending. Every indicator we have tells us that young people are spectacularly boring. They don't drink, they don't take drugs, they don't smoke, they're not having babies in the same rate that we did. When I was a teenager, we were doing all of these things and more. Right? Young people these days are really boring. They're actually quite straight. Yeah? You wouldn't believe that from the press. They sold that story for 18 months solid until it became a self-evident truth. Didn't matter what the evidence said, it was true that crime was worse. It was true that youth crime was worse. And at the last election, the second most important issue to voters after the cost of living was crime. And we have to pay National the ultimate compliment and copy their tactic. We have to talk about how the economy can be different and better, and how it can be better and make a difference to you, so that that's the issue on voters' minds in 18 months' time. And tax is only one part of that story. We can't just talk about a capital gains tax, we can't just talk about a wealth tax, we have to talk about what we're actually going to do, what we're going to spend the money on, what difference it's going to make, how we're going to explode those economic myths so we can actually lead the more productive, sustainable and inclusive society we all want to see. I'll stop talking there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Really appreciate all of your views. I'm just going to take questions from the floor. I've got one over here.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Carol Cowan. I'm from Extinction Rebellion. We have just started a campaign that I think is consistent with what you're talking about. We have just put out these leaflets, and I have a whole pile here if anybody wants to get them. We did not vote for this. We voted, many of us did not vote. 1 million of us did not vote. That's a lot of us in this small country. We have 80% of our population who are deeply concerned about the climate, and they did not vote. It's the under 40s who did not vote. And so thank you for coming to this conclusion. We're right with you.
Thank you. I think, if I may, there's something I'd add to that, which is the current government's thinking about taking away the ability to register and vote on the same day. And that's hugely dangerous, because the people who register and vote on the same day are young people. Poor people, they're Māori, they're Pacifica. They're people who rent, right? And the demographic for that skews very much in one direction in terms of voting. And we have to resist that call to remove the ability to register and vote on the same day. The job of the Electoral Commission is to make it easy and safe to vote. It should do its job. It shouldn't just take away the ability to vote. And so I support you entirely in order to, if we can get more people out to vote, if we can have more votes counted every year, that's better for democracy, it's better for all of us.
So we're trying to get people excited about voting as of now.
Yep.
I've got a question. It's about the budget on Thursday.
My favourite subject.
Well, then, a year ago in Britain they had a disaster. It was actually the threat of a budget that Truss and Kwarteng were going to do that basically collapsed their government. I know a new Conservative stayed in power, but nevertheless, it collapsed the government. Is there any chance that the economy, which is bad, will, economists will go, what on earth are these guys doing? And the similar sort of thing will happen, which could cause real problems for them. Well, so I'm hoping.
I mean, I'm in the lockup, right, at the budget. I mean, God, I hope it would, because it would be fantastic. I don't think it will be. I'm a former Treasury official, so I'm always slightly biased. We actually have a really good Treasury in New Zealand, right? It's very good at keeping the government on rails. We have a public finance system which is designed to stop exactly that sort of thing from happening. So it's very, very unlikely you'd see giant unfunded tax cuts suddenly turning up and then cross our fingers that growth turns up and then the lettuce lives longer than the Prime Minister. That's deeply unlikely, right? What might happen is one of two things, right? One, we get the budget documents and we go, well, this is a bit boring. There's nothing in here. It's sort of, they've talked it down so much that actually you get to the end and you're like, oh, I don't know what's in it for me. And that would be a disaster because there's nothing else. There's no plan B. Or we get a rabbit from a hat. And then actually we all find out something really exciting on the day and we're like, oh, hang on, what's all of this? I think it's very unlikely that we'll see a budget that will really rock the government and its ability to deliver to the call. I have one caveat, though, in that the Conservative government under Liz Truss was not a coalition government. This is a coalition government, and it's a coalition government of three parties, which means everything has to be worked out three different ways. And that's much harder to manage. And so there's a risk it falls apart after the budget, but on the day, probably not. You won't see the kind of... The day the budget was announced in the UK, there was a huge run on the pound. There was a huge run in the London stock market. We're very unlikely to see anything like that. Those kind of fireworks just don't happen here. But it'll be over time. Things will come out and things will emerge. And it's my job, the people's jobs, to actually work out what that is and to help explain that to everyone and what that means. But over time, and the fact that it doesn't collapse isn't a sign that everything's great. It's just a sign perhaps that the story hasn't come out yet.
About 3 or 6 years ago, I can't quite remember, but there was an American political scientist who came and gave a lecture to the Fabians, so it's most probably on the record somewhere. And what he had done is it analysed the Republican, the Democratic parties in the United States about their key messages. What were the words they used? He did this big analysis of all the messages that they got, and he identified about 3 or 4 key messages that the Republicans always pushed. We are the party that is you are safe with because we always fund the military. This is our core activity, okay? And the Republican politicians, that was one of the messages that they always talked about, okay? And when it came to the Democrats, they were all over the place, okay? So what it seems to, and the Nats actually, they're very creative by being very repetitive. They just push that message over and over and over again, regardless, as you indicate, the facts. It seems to me that one of the things that needs to happen is for the Labor Party to identify about half a dozen core issues and then get all the Labor Party politicians, etc., to stick to those core messages. I mean, you can do tweets and whatever, but certainly not contradict it. Okay.
Thank you. I'm an economist by trade. I'm not a psephologist. I'm not someone who does political messaging. What I would say is I'd look at the evidence. Right. So the evidence, the best evidence I can give you is the Australian voice referendum. Lost by quite a margin in Australia. There's a really good piece of work by the BBC on the Australian voice referendum. There were 4 official campaigns for yes, and they had 26 lines to explain why you should vote yes. There was 1 official no campaign, and it had 4 lines. And when people were asked, what's the line, what do you believe in this? They were much more likely to repeat the no line because they'd heard it over and over and over again. It was clear. When you asked why should you vote yes, it was like, I don't know. Because they'd never heard a consistent message from the 4 official campaigns to say yes.
It's supporting what I'm saying.
Yep. And I think you're right. I'm going to leave it up to the Labour Party and up to various other political parties to choose how to sell their messages. But what I would say is this: we have a job of work to do. I have a job of work to do. That when we hear these economic myths being said, that when we hear that they're spending all the money, or that we just need to cut back on spending, or that we need to cut back on investment, or that actually, if we don't increase the minimum wage, or if we do something else, then that will help deliver us the economic wonderland we want in the future. The evidence tells us it won't. And the evidence tells us often exactly the opposite. And we have a job to stop the perpetration of those myths in the future. And if we can do that, we can take away the key weapons that the other side uses to help demonstrate their view.
Hi, Craig. Of the myths you talked about tonight, almost all of them you'd find in the standard economic textbooks that are used by our universities here. And so there's a really extensive ingraining of that way of thinking in economists in Treasury and in business, and in those people who only do introductory economics and then become government ministers. And it seems to me there's a huge, and it's essentially telling a story about, which is derived from sort of old political thinking from the 19th century about enterprise and all that sort of good stuff. But it needs to be undermined really quite consistently, I think, before a lot of those things can actually be reversed. So austerity is part of what you'd find in a standard text, etc. How do we undermine your profession?
Well, I don't actually think it is undermining my profession. I think my profession has a job of work to do to actually explain its assumptions clearly. The first job of an economist is to say, I believe this under these assumptions. The free market works perfectly under a set of assumptions that never appear in the real world. Yeah? One of the assumptions for a free market is that we have non-satiation. We can never have enough goods. You buy one apple, you're happy, 2 apples, 3 apples, 10,000 apples. The 20,000th apple, you're still happy to consume. You have perfect information about the price of all goods, not just now, but all goods now and in the future. These things don't hold true, right? And many of the assumptions that make up many of our fundamental economic models need to be challenged, because actually they don't hold up in the real world. One of the standard assumptions is an assumption called the NAIRU rate. Yeah? The non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, for those of you who are following along. Right? That is, any attempt to reduce inflation below this certain level of unemployment just simply leads to higher levels of inflation. Yeah? Only we don't know what NAIRU is, and we keep changing what the rate is, and then it doesn't turn up in the real world. So we have a job of work to do to explain our assumptions, but importantly, we have to reduce our desire to forecast. Our job is to explain what has happened in the past, rather than attempting to then say this should therefore occur in the future, and be less positivist about it, and be more about, well, actually, this has occurred in the past, and you might want to learn some lessons from it. And that's why the teaching of economic history, which has been lost from university departments, is so important.
Craig, one of the points that I think is true on your list of events that we didn't anticipate is the fact that the news media have collapsed into a different form of industry than we were even a year ago. The loss of TV3 is a good example, and then the fact that we're having to resurrect a news service somehow in New Zealand. I really resent the fact that whenever we have an economist on the TV, they're already employed by a bank. It's not as if somehow that's not a bias. I know you're employed by the CTU. Well, that's a bias too, and thank God we've got one in the CTU. Where are we going to find better news coverage of our economy so that we can become more informed?
First of all, can I ask a quick question? Who here is a member of a trade union? Thank you, because you pay my wages. And it's very important, that we join trade unions, that we join organisations like the FABE, we join other organisations so that we can give voice to exactly those points, those opinions, those changes of fact that actually, you won't hear from when the ANZ economist from blah says X, or, the taxpayers union economist says Y, because they're rowing a particular boat. I don't want to attack my friends in the media, not because I have to work with them every day, which is true, but also because they're not to blame for news consumption. That's all of us. We consume news in a very different way, and the model has to change. What we do have to do is to value news differently. And I personally believe that we should treat news as a utility, in much the same way as we should treat water, in much the same way as we should treat electricity. It's essential for the public good. And if we underinvest in news, and if we underinvest in reporting and actually finding things out, then we'll suffer the consequences on the other side. Because someone will believe somebody on TikTok telling them something is true, rather than actually what is an objective truth somewhere else. It's actually in all of our interests to support a really strong fourth estate, and we may have to pay for that, to do that. And I personally don't have a problem with doing that. There are ways in which we can do that, but we have to change our value in that space so that we rely less upon the advertising model, which has been the way of doing this in the past historically, and move more towards a model which is actually treating news as a public good, as a utility.
Oh, kia ora.
Kia ora.
You talked about the sort of lifetime downstream consequences of a year of unemployment.
Yep.
Do you have any information about how that affects different sectors of the community?
Oh, do
more or
I?
less? Particularly, I was thinking in COVID, the unemployment was disproportionately women's work, and in these public sector cuts, I think that may also be the case.
Oh, thank you. I'll slip you the money later for asking. Because I could talk about this for the next 4 hours, so get comfy. The impacts of unemployment, you're absolutely right, fall disproportionately on different groups. Right? Māori unemployment is 2.5 times the Pākehā rate. Pacifica unemployment is 3.5 times that rate. The first people who lose their jobs in a recession are women, young people, Māori, Pacifica. Tall, handsome people, white people like me, we don't lose our jobs. We'll be okay, right? And so where does that impact fall? It falls in urban areas. It tends to fall on those groups who are already poor. It falls on those who were last into the labour market. Why is that important? Because if you just come into the labour market and you're the first out of the door, it's going to take a really long time to come back in. If you're established in the labour market and you've got a good job, you tend not to lose your job. The acquisition of skills, therefore, becomes different, because why would I go out and get a skill if I'm going to be permanently in and out of work? I can't get enough money to save for a house, which means I don't have an asset at the end of my life, which means I'm renting, which means when I'm retired, I'm poor, because I'm still having to pay rent, rather than living rent-free in a house that I own. There are lifetime consequences to these things, which make a big difference, but the costs of those fall on those with the narrowest shoulders. And there are some things that we can do quite easily to help solve some of these problems. We can make KiwiSaver contributions during maternity leave. Make a huge difference to women's lifetime savings for their pension. It doesn't cost the Crown a huge amount of money, and actually deepens the amount of capital available to New Zealand firms, because that money gets invested. There's a bunch of things that we can do in this space, but the simple thing that we should do first is not accept that unemployment is natural or should happen. If we can accept that and actually say, how do we get people into work? How do we make sure they're in good, rewarding work? And how do we make work pay? Then actually we solve all the rest of the problems in the economy. Sorry, I'll stop proselytising there because it's actually quite...
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to take 3 more questions. I've got one up here, and then if you just put your hands up.
Kia ora.
So the first question, I've got 2. The first one is reasonably brief. The first question is, where did you get your data about you being so handsome, Craig?
Oh, well. I mean, it's anecdote, but...
no, it's good data, it's good data.
It's the repeated nature
it's
of
good
it,
data,
which will tell me I can only report what I'm told.
It's good data, Craig, I was just joking. So the second question is, you had that graph up where New Zealand was right towards the rightmost, and you said 50% of our income comes from individual taxes.
Correct.
But the other 30% of that income was GST. which I would argue is also individual taxes.
Correct.
So we get a huge chunk of our money from individuals who earn fuck all on the global in the Western economy.
That's a technical phrase, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good one. It catches the ear. But the question I've got, the national government has been expert in rolling out this barrage of undoings and this kind of death by approximately 35 cuts. It's going to take the left a lot of time to undo that work and get us back to protect where we were. What I'm asking is New Zealand grown up enough, and can we get good enough at forming and framing the data to do one big thing rather than focusing on undoing all of those small things? And the one big thing, just to be even more leading, might have something to do with how little tax we pay on property, and as you said, how much we overinvest in it. And is New Zealand ready to do something like that, and how can we shape that data to convince us that we are?
I don't think this is a data question. I don't think there's any kind of level of data that I could show you that would convince the majority of New Zealanders one way or the other. I think it helps, but I don't think it's the thing that clinches it at the end of the day. We have to stop talking about means and start talking about ends. So rather than talking about tax, as the Labour Party, we love talking about tax, right? We'll talk about tax until the cows come home, right? And it turns the public off because we sound like we're talking about how I'm going to take more money from you. Instead, we should be talking about ends. Why is it that there's 352 schools that the school rebuild program's just been stopped? Right? Why is it that when we took office, we had mould and God knows whatever else in the walls of hospitals? Right? That we hadn't invested in hospitals for years? Why is it that this incoming government has stopped the state housing build programme? These are the ends. These are the things we need to achieve. These are our needs. And we need as a country to talk about our needs. We're going to hear an awful lot of this budget about wants. We want to give people a tax cut. We want a smaller public service. We want a blah, 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 blah. We want. And they're not going to be talking about needs. What does New Zealand need? And we have a job to articulate to people when we succeed and we deliver on our needs, we're a better country. When people have what they need to get by, we're all better off. And so stop talking about the means. The means are just the formulation as to how to get there, and we'll find an efficient way of doing it. Talk about the ends. What does a great health system look like? What does a great education system look like? What does a great housing system look like? And how do we get there? And we can deliver the tax cut to do that. But instead, we don't want to have a conversation about the tax because we're talking to people about something that naturally they go, can I have less, please? Right? Instead, we want to talk to people about what they want to have more and sell them that story, that vision of a better country that they're a part of, that they've got a place in. Because that's the only way we're actually going to change the system. People can see a future and they can see their part in that future, and we can do it together. The tax system follows. But talk about the ends rather than the means.
This is another tax question. Do you have knowledge of any modelling on what would be the effects of making the first $20,000 of income tax-free as it is in Australia?
As in fiscally or as in economically? Both. Okay. Fiscally, fiscally, you'd be looking at somewhere in the order of having to find $8 to $10 billion in money. It's an enormous amount because everyone gets it, right? It's an enormous amount of cash. You suddenly have to find. Now, there would be an economic flow through because there are people having more money in their pockets. They're able to do more things. The economy would grow more quickly. That's great. But then it has an inflationary impact on the other side, so you lose someone. So it's a careful, you have to step into that quite carefully. So fiscally, it's an enormous gap you'd have to find. And it's not really practical to talk about 20,000, because that's quite a large amount of money to suddenly take out of the tax system. And if you offset it with other taxes, you're going to have to offset those other taxes at quite high levels, which might then become quite distortionary in of themselves. So again, you've got to step through quite carefully if you want a tax-free zone, what that means and what the impact of that is. Because the last thing you want to do is to give everyone a giant tax cut, just in a different way, stimulate further inflation, which reduces the value of the tax cut in the first place. So 20,000 is quite a lot. There was work done previously to try and work out how much you could deliver a 10,000 tax-free zone. That would give everybody $1,050 in terms of tax back in their pockets, about $20 a week, and that was about $3.5–4 billion in terms of cost. So that's more doable, but even then, that's quite a large amount of money to find on the other side, and it's quite radical reform of the tax system. I would personally argue, if we suddenly had the ability to find $3.5–4 billion a year, are there uses that I could find for it that wouldn't be a tax cut? And I could find lots of uses for it that I think would deliver better well-being outcomes for New Zealanders than a tax cut. I could reform hugely the welfare state. I could lift tens of thousands of kids out of poverty with that money. And would I be happy to do it? Oh yeah. The number of children in New Zealand who are in material poverty, right? That means they don't have 2 hot meals a day. They don't have a pair of winter shoes. They don't have a winter coat, right? Their family regularly goes without trips to the doctors or the dentist because they can't afford it. They regularly feel cold or damp in their house. That rose 36,000 last year in the last measure. There's now 130-something thousand children living in material poverty in New Zealand. In a country as wealthy as New Zealand, that's a sin. There's so much more we can do with that money, and I'd rather use that money to tackle that problem because that has lifetime benefits for people. And if this was a government that genuinely believed in social investment, that is what it would be doing right now.
My question's about, not about tax.
Good, thank you.
It's about how successfully the wealthy have managed to invest in a government which now diverts more and more money to them. For example, a huge amount of money that's now going to landlords. The little question I want to ask as an example about this is about the discussion that we had earlier about the media and investing in the media. Because one of the examples we see of public money being invested in the media currently is the public money that washes through the Wright family, who take a huge amount of public money to fund their corporate childcare centres, which provide substandard childcare, not education, and then washes on to prop up Sean Plunkett. Because the Wright family are the main investors behind his program. How can we make sure that not only are there overt diversions, like Shane Jones's mining mates and landlords, but also those who have managed to get wealthy on cornering government money, which they are using to do things which the government should be doing itself?
Thank you for such a legally straightforward question to answer. At the request of my lawyers, I won't talk about the Wright family in that sense. But what I will say is this: is that there are plenty of countries actually where ECE just is that example. In Canada, ECE will now cost $10 a day. And can you imagine in New Zealand, ECE costing $10 a day? Can you imagine what that would do for family budgets? Right? I'm the owner of a 5-year-old. Yeah? Right? I can tell you how much ECE has cost me. And I don't mind paying a penny of it. Right? Because as the treasurer of an ECE centre, I can tell you how much money that centre made, which was nothing. Yeah? It costs a lot of money to deliver a great ECE system, but it's one of the best investments we can make as a country, right? Quite how we've got to a situation where we have a privatized ECE system, which essentially farms children for profit, I do not understand, yeah? Again, if we genuinely believed in social investment, it's one of the areas we make one of the biggest investments in. Last year, the Nobel Prize for Economics was won by a couple who showed the best investments in economics were those made in the first 1,000 days. Yeah? We can do that. What I would say is this: the easiest way to tackle these problems, right, about cornering markets, about people being concerned about graft, people being concerned about corruption. New Zealand has a wonderfully uncorrupt system, and I love it to death. We worry about corruption in New Zealand in ways that other countries would just go, move on, that's not corruption, right? And again, I come from one, but in New Zealand, the easiest way we can do that is to actually make sure we're genuinely delivering value for money. We're genuinely making sure that public money is being spent well. It's for two reasons. One, when it's spent well, we continue the social license to spend it well. Right? People will happily hand over their money when they're confident it's actually going to do good things. Yeah? And two, it takes the politics out of that decision. It becomes something we can invest in consistently over time. And one of the things that's bedeviled New Zealand, particularly infrastructure investment, public sector investment, is we've seen these boom and busts over time, because we haven't been able to consistently invest in value for money to show that actually we're delivering good outcomes for New Zealanders. I personally believe there's nothing right-wing about value for money. In fact, one of the best things the left can do is take back the language of value for money and talk about that in ways that mean something for people. And if we can demonstrate value for money, if we can demonstrate that our public sector is doing good things, we win the argument. And you importantly don't get perhaps the kinds of outcomes that you see which are less desirable over time.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you, everybody, for participating today and the quality of questions. I always appreciate hearing Craig speak. I'm very glad we've recorded this because I can't keep up. And it's very useful to go back and refer to that. And I hope that someone here who's been recorded sends it to Nicola Willis for the budget, so they can have a little reminder of what maybe they missed in there a little bit. So thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight.
Thank you.
Just a couple of announcements and information.
Yeah, hi guys, just a Fabian announcement. 3 programs coming up. The wonderful Helen Clark has been invited to speak on AUKUS. We're awaiting her make a decision on it. We've got Mark Goshi who's going to be speaking on the OIA that's coming out about the Kāinga Ora lies and that Bill English has created. And we're looking forward to James Robb, who has written one of the most fantastic Labour history books on Mr. Holland that you'll ever come across.
It is really good.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. And so James will...
Sydney, it's Harold.
Oh, Harold. And Sydney Holland, no, good. He will be being interviewed, hopefully, by Richard Northey. Thank you very much.